very much. I'm acutely aware, listening to the last two speakers, that we're in danger of covering some of the same ground. So in the interest of getting more people up here to be interrogated, I'll walk through quickly. But Justin and I thought it might be useful to give the perspective of where we think not this building has come, but the whole concept of smart and the whole smart buildings industry, where it's come from, and where WiredScore, where we think it's going, to the extent that we have any crystal ball, which of course we don't. So as I said, that's what I'll talk through now. If you roll your minds back a decade or so, and I realise saying that there will be a bunch of people in this room scoffing at me, saying, a decade? I've been doing this for 30 years. Smart buildings are a lot older than a decade. But from my perspective, I started thinking about smart buildings about a decade ago, and I think most of these questions were unanswered there. So I'm standing up here and saying we're rolling back a decade when we think about where smart buildings have come from. So, as I said, at the time I was at British Land trying to work out how we put technology in buildings to make them better. And these were the kind of questions we're asking. What is a smart building? And that's both, what is a smart building in terms of what's the word for this thing we're talking about, but also what stuff is in a building to make it smart? And then who can help me make one? We had, at the time, hundreds and hundreds of different people coming and talking about all sorts of different bits of tech, and it felt at the time like we had a lot of tech people who didn't necessarily understand real estate talking to a lot of real estate people who definitely didn't understand anything about tech. And there's a real difficulty in trying to find out how you connect those two audiences. Then another question we and I think based on my experiences at the time, a lot of the industry were wrestling with is what happens if we do go and sign someone up? Are we stuck with them? Particularly if we want to answer the fourth question, which is how on earth do I get all these systems to talk to each other? It seems pretty obvious that you need to get the systems to talk to each other to achieve any kind of benefit. But if I go with one company, particularly if I'm someone like British Land who owns building after building in a location, do I have to stick with them in every other building for the rest of that building's life? Because that doesn't seem like it's great economic sense. It really means that whoever's supplying the tech can charge whatever they want the second time, third time, fourth time. Then how do I know what my tenants want? How do I know what my employees want? I had a lot of conversations at that point talking to the tenants of our buildings saying, how interested are you in smart buildings? And every single one of them said, no, thank you very much, that sounds expensive. But then when you break down all the bits, the answer was completely the opposite. Every single thing, like, I want some of that, and I want some of that, and I want some of that. So it was trying to understand actually, what do people want? And then obviously, topping all of that off, where do I put my money? Real estate is an industry still that I think is incredibly good at spending $1 billion building a building, which is a pretty risky thing to do. We heard about how this building PC'd in a global pandemic. There's a massive risk there in building a building, but we're quite good at spending as an industry huge amounts of money on that sort of risk. Whereas I found trying to get 100 grand out of Excurve British Land, a comparatively tiny sum of money, was incredibly difficult, because how do you know what the ROI is going to be, and how do you know where to put your money? So that's where I think we've come from. That's where I think those are the big questions, and I don't for a second want to suggest that every single one of those is answered, but I'll talk through where I think some of them, where we've got to now. But bringing all that together, what do I think, therefore, the fundamental problems that collectively as an industry we were trying to solve, and that we thought technology in our buildings could be part of the answer? The first one is user demand. Think back again, like I say, a decade. Think what you could do at home. Think what you can do now. Think what you could do at home. And so what people working in offices, people going to shops, were used to being able to do with technology. And then think what the office was like. Over the prior 30 years, your home environment, your personal life had changed out of all recognition, and you were coming back 20, 30 years in time and going to an office that hadn't really changed since the PC was introduced in whatever it was, the 80s, early 90s. The second thing is the climate crisis. I suspect we can all look back and say we wished we moved a little bit faster 10 years ago, and maybe we'd be in a slightly better state now, but it was certainly still something that was being talked about. And so there was a recognition that somewhere technology needed to play a part in that statistic that I know we've all heard hundreds and hundreds of times, that 40% of our emissions come from the built environment. So clearly the built environment needs to do something about reducing emissions. The third thing is changing work habits. That was starting, and goodness, I think it's changed quite a lot more for reasons that were slightly unpredictable, as we've already discussed at the time. But changing work habits were obviously happening, and how do you build an office that is ready for hybrid, even if hybrid wasn't something we really, in the case of many employers, I think really hugely bought into pre-pandemic. And then the last thing is the evolution in the industry, and at the risk of really being rude to my real estate colleagues and relying that there are more tech people than real estate people in the room, I think that over the last 20 or 30 years there's been a transformative change in how real estate has worked. The huge influx of capital from sovereign wealth and other sources has meant there's been a real professionalization and a focus on those marginal gains. How do you drive efficiency? How do you drive effectiveness in a way that it didn't really matter quite so much 30 or 40 years before? So to me, those were the problems that were sitting in front of us, whatever it is, a decade or so ago, that we thought technology could help solve. And to try and reinforce my point, although these stats aren't a decade old, a huge majority of office workers, these stats are 3 or 4 years old rather than a decade old, a huge majority of office workers both said they wanted their office space to be technologically advanced, and that it was really important that that office space was sustainable as well. And then on the occupier side, a vast majority of them said they intended to increase the use of technology, and a significant minority said that they would pay 20% more for space that was technologically enabled. So that's where we get to SmartScore, and I make no apologies that I'm going to now talk about what my view is of what a smart building is via the vessel of SmartScore, because that's where I work. I work for WiredScore. I've been on both sides of this debate, because at the beginning of the inception of SmartScore, I was at British Land telling William and Tom and people like that and Sanj that we really needed in the industry one person to bring together all the different perspectives and say, well, what is a smart building and what does good really look like? And then halfway through that process, I came over to lead the product team and actually build the thing. So with that said, exposing the fact that I obviously have a bias in this, what do I think a smart building is? This is the definition that we've come up with. A smart building is one that delivers outcomes for all users with digital technology to exceed evolving expectations. And if there's one word that I think really matters in this, ironically, it's not the technology, it's the word outcomes. And that's because, for me, and when I started talking about this, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, it seemed like that was not a universally accepted view. And I'm delighted for people to come and chest poke me afterwards and tell me that they still disagree with it. But I think it's an increasingly accepted point of view that outcomes is where you've got to start. If you start with the technology, you go in the wrong direction. You've got to start with what do you want it to do. And the way we think about it at WiredScore is there's 2 parts to building a smart building. There's the user functionality, which is a lot of the outcome stuff. What do you want the building to do for the people that one way or another have a stake in it? Whether you have a stake in it because you're coming into work, or whether you have a stake in it because you've invested in it and you want to yield a positive return from it, or anything in between those, what are the outcomes you want that building to achieve? And then underpinning it, what are the foundations that you need to build that on? Because you can't just talk about the outcomes, you need to also talk about how are you going to make sure that you've got a robust and resilient technologically enabled building. I put this slide in because I realized at this point, it really makes it sound like there's been a bunch of crazy tech bros sitting in a room somewhere defining to the industry what's right. And I want to emphasize that's not how we did it at all. We gathered together at this point a whole bunch of people from across the industry, whether they were real estate investors and operators, whether they were smart building consultants, or whether they were solution providers. And I know there's a number of you in this room who are part of this process, to come together to understand what right really looked like, what the right answer was insofar as there can be one, and what good really looked like. And here's a selection of them that I've just lifted from our pitch decks, and you can see AXA, of course, is one of the companies that was involved in this, with this building therefore being part of the genesis of that. So very quickly, and I'll skip through this, so what does that mean? Like I said, the way we think about it is you start with the outcomes, Then you think about user functionalities, and it's all underpinned by the tech. So the outcomes, those are our 4 outcomes, and I'm not going to read these slides out, but I'm super happy if you want to come and grab me afterwards. I'd be delighted to talk about any of these more. Those are the 4 outcomes, and we think any brilliant smart building will deliver excellent outcomes across all 4 of these. These are the 6 categories that we've decided that the user stories break up into. And what I mean by that is the way we think about this is you define a long list of different user stories that one can choose to or not choose to fulfill. For example, simplistically, as an office worker, I want to quickly and easily find and book a meeting room. That's a user story, and that wraps up into individual and collaborative productivity. And so that wraps up like that. And when it comes to SmartScore, how we score, you simply allocate number of points to how well that is scored. Underpinning all of those is the technological foundation, and it's worth noting that there isn't actually a vertical one-to-one connection between them. It's just a graphical quirk. And this is about how are you making sure that you're building a building that is connected and is resiliently connected, that it's got a great network, that it's got the sufficient consideration to cybersecurity, and all those things that if you don't pay attention to it, it just won't work. And so that's how we think of smart building. That's where I think we are today. And of course, I would say that, wouldn't I? And happy to discuss afterwards. That's where I think we are today. Where do I think we're going? What's next for smart buildings? It seems to me that over the last decade or so, technology has been the big disruptor in the real estate industry. And I think that wave has not passed, but we're now in a situation that instead there are a number of other things happening in the world for which technology in the real estate industry is going to be part of the solution. So we were debating in the office the other day whether we're in a time of polycrisis or permacrisis, and I don't know which, and neither of them sound like a great place to be, but I think we are in a time when we all recognise that and there's probably a lot more than 3 I could have put up here, but I've selected 3. The climate crisis, economic crisis that is brewing, if not fully underway, and an energy crisis, a crisis about how we transform our energy to make it more sustainable and also give us energy independence, because I think we're all rapidly realising the cost of not doing that. And of course, all 3 of them interrelate. But my contention is these are the areas that collectively we need to focus, and collectively the area that smart buildings needs to focus on to get us through the next, I don't know what it is, 5, 10 plus years. So a focus on sustainability. We need to focus on sustainability. And what does that mean? That means working out how we use tech to make a building more energy efficient, had to reduce its emissions, both whole life emissions, including everything that goes into the building of the building, and the ongoing emissions of the building. It's asking questions like, how do I also make it more flexible so that I don't need to keep ripping it down, or so that I don't need to keep refitting it every time someone comes in, so it can be flexible? How can I use technology to do that? In terms of the economic side of things, the ROI, I had ROI up at the beginning as a question that we were debating a decade ago, and I think we're to a certain extent still there, although we've seen already the previous 2 presenters have had some really obvious and compelling stats that we have got to the stage that we're starting to see in the industry now, real evidence of how smart buildings actually can improve the ROI of a building. And that means that we can start to go to the next stage, which is how can we use the technology in the building to gather the data to make much better long-term decisions, and also prove to our investors, to our occupiers, that we are delivering a great ROI. So there's 2 halves of this in my mind. There's how do you use the technology to make the building better from a ROI perspective in this case, but also then how do you use the technology to prove that you've done it? Because proving that you've done it then unlocks the ability to make more investment, which again further reduces the emissions and improves the ROI. And then the last thing is resilience. People have talked a lot about ESG, and there is increasingly, I think, a 4th pillar to the world of ESG, which is the pillar of resilience. And frankly, that's for the slightly depressing reason that I think we're in the stage now that we acknowledge that no matter how much we reduce, how much we improve our emissions, we are still in a situation that there is going to be negative outcomes from the climate. And so how do we not only build buildings that reduce the emissions, but are also resilient to the changes that are nevertheless going to come down the line? And that is really, really important. And I think those are the three things that in the real estate industry, with the use of technology, we're going to need to focus on over the coming years. And my contention, again, is that smart buildings are fundamental to achieving that. And I'm done. So we can...